For those of you who don't know me, I'm Simon Lewis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this public forum. Before going much further, it's custom to recognise the traditional owners of the land in which you meet today and pay tribute to their leaders, past, present and emerging. So we're delighted to do that. I will also make a disclosure, which is that obviously we've got a fantastic speaker today, but he I'm sure would want us to recognise the fact that he is speaking for his personal view. The other thing that I'm feeling completely inadequate about is my own record of research and contribution to the society that we exist in the community of Parkinson's and related diseases. And the reason for that is because by the end of this morning, you're going to just ask yourself the question, how does Prof Bloem do everything that he does? And the answer I have is that he doesn't sleep and he has a very forgiving wife. Because he just is a force of nature in our field, and we're delighted to have him in the country. We're going to get him to do two presentations today. He's swapped the order on us because he wants us to appreciate what he sees as the problem and then appreciate what he sees as some potential solutions. So we're going to start off, and many of you will be familiar with the book that Bas has co-authored, which I think he's going to touch on heavily in this. It's available at all good bookstores and Amazon, and so it's, there'll be a QR code and all of those things. If you've got your copy with you, I'm sure he'll autograph it with you, and that'll be fine. Without further ado, Bas, can I invite you to come along and give your first presentation? Please welcome Prof Bloem.
Good. Well, Simon, stay here for 1 minute, because you should be grateful for having such a wonderful neurologist in your area. Yeah. Simon is amazing. His hospitality is legendary. I've been treated like a god, a Dutch god. But he's got a great heart, and he's got a great passion to improve your lives. And I really think he deserves a round of applause for his work. So yes, I decided to switch the order of the presentations. We'll start with the problem first. Parkinson's is the world's fastest growing neurological condition. That's a concern that we need to think about and act. And then in my second talk, we'll be talking about solutions. I think that's better to end with solutions and a better future, but to start with the problem first. So my main disclosure is I'm Dutch. And this is how a neurologist in my country practices medicine. There's invariably a cow and a little church. And I always say we have survived history by negotiating and collaborating. We were squeezed in between France and Germany and England. And they're all interested in occupying the Netherlands. And the only way to survive was by negotiating. And this is why I'm still here. My other disclosure is that there's a psychiatrist in my hospital who's convinced that I carry a mutation in the gene for optimism. So you will hear throughout my talk that although there are alarming signals about the growth of Parkinson's, there's also reason for optimism and perspectives. And I definitely have that mutation in that gene. She thinks she can find it by studying me as an N of 1 study. But you'll see that I'm very optimistic about the future. That's not to say that Parkinson's isn't a horrible disease to live with today. But I think there are perspectives, and I'm here to also offer hope. I'll be speaking about what we have described in the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. I'll end with the book, and I'll start with the book. We're not making any money out of the book. All proceeds go to the greater good, research into Parkinson's disease. The book has been translated in multiple languages. It's called The Parkinson Pandemie in Dutch. It's even been translated into Chinese and German. So it's gaining momentum, and that's good because there is really something happening. And what is happening is that Parkinson's is the world's fastest growing neurological disease. The disease has doubled in the last 20 years, and it will double again in the next 20 years if we don't act. We think there are currently about 7 million people with Parkinson's in the world, but I think it's actually a lot more, because we're not seeing all the individuals, for example, in Africa. And in Africa, Parkinson's is growing fast because all the toxic pesticides that have been forbidden and banned in Western countries are now dumped onto the African market. And combined with an aging population, it's causing a fast rise of Parkinson's in Africa. These are all individuals who more or less recently announced they have Parkinson's. So it's a disease that affects artists. And you'll recognize your favorite singer here, perhaps. These are sportsmen. We'll talk about sports in a minute and the importance of exercise for all of you. But this is just to show that exercise doesn't give you full protection against Parkinson's. Even elite athletes may develop the disease. Actors, you'll recognize Michael J. Fox, for example, but also others. This is Paul Bocuse, a famous French chef who developed Parkinson's. And this is the famous actor, it's in Dutch, Lars von Trier. You may have heard of him. And then, of course, perhaps one of the most well-known figures in the world is Pope John Paul. Now, what is striking about all these images? They were all men. They were only men. So that's odd. And there's at least two reasons. I think one reason is Parkinson's is more common in men than in women. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because it tells us a little bit about the etiology of the disease. But another reason is that men are more, I think, more outgoing. They more easily promote themselves on social media, and so I think there's a bias. This is not reflective of the real gender distribution. I will come to that in a minute, but men are definitely more often affected. This is one example of a female patient. I'm not sure if there's any famous female individuals here in your country, but this is Linda Ronstadt for the fans. She's got Parkinson's. So one commonly given explanation for the fast rise of Parkinson's is aging. And yes, aging is a factor. The disease is more common as we grow older. And since we grow older on average and the absolute maximum age is also increasing, it is a factor. You can also see the gender difference. The light curve is men and the dark curve is women. So yes, aging is a factor. But what is really interesting, and this is a complex graph, and the only thing you need to look at is this little box here, is that after correction for the aging effect, stroke is actually becoming less prevalent in the world because we're better at preventing strokes. So that's good news. And Alzheimer's disease is growing fast, but it's explained completely by aging. So if you correct for the aging effect, Alzheimer's remains more or less stable. Does that make sense? And the only disease that is growing over and above the aging effect, and literally this was the only disease in this international survey, was Parkinson's disease. So it's not just aging. And in fact, I think aging is not a cause of Parkinson's. What international famous neurologists have done is they toured museums in Europe. They've looked at textbooks, novels, poetry, paintings, to search for Parkinson's prior to 1817. And it existed. There are rare descriptions, but it was a rare disease prior to 1817. Until, of course, environmental pollution happened in London, where James Parkinson described the disease for the first time. And of course, in history, people did grow old occasionally, and they were astute clinicians in those days. So if Parkinson's disease had happened prior to 1817, we should have seen it. If it had occurred in the magnitude that we're seeing today, it should have caught people's eyes. And don't forget, Parkinson's is not a disease of exclusively old people. In the Netherlands, 1 in 3 is below the age of 65 when the disease starts, which is when you're in the middle of life, when you're still at work, and you know, when you do want to, and this is Michael J. Fox, of course. So, and if we would have seen, if young onset Parkinson's disease had existed prior to 1817, we should have seen it. There should have been reports in the medical literature, but there are virtually none. And I think this slide still has the Dutch legends. It says cumulative exposure on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. And I think that aging merely means that we've had more time to be exposed to toxic chemicals. That's basically it. So that's why aging is a factor. So is it better diagnostics? And I don't think so. What you see in red is Parkinson's disease and its growth, and in blue you see multiple sclerosis. The diagnosis of multiple sclerosis has been revolutionized by the advent of MRI and cerebral spinal fluid techniques, and it's remained more or less stable. Whereas Parkinson's disease is diagnosed today in the exact same way that James Parkinson diagnosed Parkinson's in 1817. I do it with my bare hands. I do it by listening to you, by looking at you, and you don't need any brain scans. So I don't think it's better diagnostics. Is it genetics, perhaps? Yes, there is a genetic component to Parkinson's. There are 8 genes that can cause Parkinson's disease. 2 dominant genes, goes from generation to generation, and 6 recessive genes. What is really interesting, and this is a new paper that's under review, I hope it will be accepted soon, is that these mutations typically cause young onset Parkinson's disease. And I wondered how old these mutations are. And you can calculate that. So this is a brand new perspective, which I think is interesting. A genetic mutation arises somewhere in the world. It's like a stone that's been dropped in a pond, and then it starts to spread, like waves. Based on the spread of GBA, one of the most common mutations causing Parkinson's disease, which is present in 10 to 15% of Dutch Parkinson patients, that mutation is estimated to be 8,000 years old. 8,000 years. So if GBA itself was the cause of Parkinson's, we should have seen the disease before 1817. GBA in animal models interacts with pesticides. So that mutation that's been around for 8,000 years only became relevant once we started polluting our environment. So it makes you susceptible to exposure to toxic chemicals. But I don't think GBA, for the majority of people, is by itself a sufficient reason for causing Parkinson's. The same is true for LARC2. It's thousands of years old, and LARC2 interacts with pesticides in animal models. Another line of evidence comes from monozygotic twins. As you may know, monozygotic twins are genetically identical. So what people have reasoned, and they've done this not just for Parkinson's, they've done this for all sorts of diseases. People have reasoned if you are genetically identical, and if the genetic contribution to a particular disease is substantial, monozygotic twins should have the same disease more often than you would expect based on chance alone, and that would be dizygotic twins, right? Does that make sense? And people have looked at this, and look at this graph. This is also in the same paper that we just submitted. At the top, you can see type 1 diabetes, which has a strong genetic component. And look at Parkinson's, it's right there at the bottom. So yes, there is a genetic component to Parkinson's, but it's small. It's small. There is something else going on. And indeed, and I realize this is a complex slide, but these are all the known genes for Parkinson's disease. And these are environmental interactions that we know that exist. And it includes many pesticides, it includes heavy metals. So the genes predispose individuals to a certain susceptibility towards toxic influences from our environment. So I'm increasingly convinced that Parkinson's disease is to a large extent a man-made disease, just like the pyramids in Egypt have been created by man in a miraculous way. This is a disease that is caused by ourselves. And what I'm saying here explicitly is, I feel like I'm an activist to try and solve this painful issue. This does not mean that you should blame yourself for having Parkinson's, but I'm making that very explicit here. This is caused by industry. This is caused by big companies polluting our environment. You're not to blame yourself. It's impossible to say that your Parkinson's is caused by that particular exposure. You can't. And I'll come to other factors later in my second presentation, which I think is hugely important. So don't blame yourself. Don't think, oh, if only I hadn't worked in that factory, I would not have Parkinson's today. It's impossible to tell. It's a complex interplay between your genetic predisposition, what you ate, what you breathed, where you worked, and all of that ultimately decides whether or not you develop Parkinson's disease. But at the group level, I think the environmental contribution to Parkinson's is clear. and I think it's painful. So looking back at history, James Parkinson was the first to describe the disease in London, which incidentally he actually did based on individuals which to a large extent he merely observed walking on the streets of London. That's how visible and recognizable the Parkinson syndrome is. And of course, I don't think it's a coincidence that James Parkinson described what he called, "I'm seeing something new," because this is London in those days. Huge environmental pollution, and they've estimated that the amount of air pollution at the time in London with the notorious smog, you may remember that, is only surpassed by certain cities in India today, but it was gross. And this is China today. This is China today, and what is really fascinating is we published a paper in Journal of Parkinson's Disease, and what you see here is the x-axis is the growth in income, and on the y-axis is the growth in Parkinson's disease. And here you can see China. Parkinson's is exploding in China, where they are now having their industrial revolution with lots of environmental pollution. It's not just air pollution. We now know that repeated head trauma is a possible contributor to Parkinson's. So we know from Scottish soccer, or do you say football here? Soccer. Scottish soccer players have a higher risk of Parkinson's, and it's related to the number of headers. People estimate that the headers are important. So midfielders have a low, if you're interested in soccer, the headers mainly happen in defenders and the attackers, and they've got more often Parkinson's than the midfielders who play the Barcelona tiki-taki football. And then there is this interesting gender difference. You've seen this slide before. Parkinson's is more common in men compared to women. And one explanation is that men more often have jobs that predispose them to exposure to toxic chemicals, such as being a farmer or a welder or a metal laborer or a chemical worker or pest control worker. One chemical, which I'm not sure how that is dealt with in your country, happy to hear that, is trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene is a chemical that's used in many places. It's used to laundry in laundries. It's used to degrease metals. It used to be a part of Tipex. Remember when we were using type machines? And it's in shoe polish. It's used to decaffeinate coffee. And we published this paper recently about trichloroethylene as an invisible cause of Parkinson's. This is a busy slide, and I realize, but this is all the different chemicals in our environment that contain trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene, in people who worked in trichloroethylene factories, have a very high risk of Parkinson's. Trichloroethylene kills dopamine neurons in animals if you expose them to trichloroethylene. And these are countries in the world where it's abundant, and I now realize, there you go, there's Australia. So these are countries with so-called Superfund sites, where there's a lot of trichloroethylene in the environment. And we call it the invisible cause of Parkinson's, because if you live here, and there's a factory at some distance, the factories dump it into the environment, it goes into the groundwater, it can travel for miles, evaporate into your house, you can't see it, you can't smell it, but it may contribute to your Parkinson's. And a recent study, I didn't enter the slide, in JAMA Neurology, you probably have seen it, in Camp Lejeune, where the American Marines are being trained. There was a chemical factory prior to the military base. It's heavily polluted by trichloroethylene, and there's a wave of Parkinson's among American Marines in Camp Lejeune. Very convincing relationship between trichloroethylene and Parkinson's. And then another chemical, of course, another job and chemical is the job of farming and the use of pesticides. This is a cartoon drawn by one of my patients who is a lovely and wonderful artist. She's amazing, really graphically depicting in one image the tight interrelationship between pesticides and Parkinson's. Men are more often farmers, except for one country in the world, which is Japan, and lo and behold, Japan is one of very few countries where Parkinson's is more common in women than in men. Now that doesn't prove anything, but taken together, the whole story is unfolding and beginning to come together. And then there is the so-called MPTP story. Have you heard of MPTP? I'll quickly tell you the story. In the 80s of the previous century, heroin was only illegal in the United States if it was exactly heroin. It had to be exactly the chemical compound. So what so-called kitchen chemists were doing is modify heroin just a little bit. They added a fluor atom or a carbon atom, and then it was legal as sea salt. And if as a drug addict you were lucky, it still caused the same sensations that you were hoping, but it was legal. And one of those, and they called it designer drugs, just like some of you may have your own designer dress. You know, when you go to a fancy party, it's your unique dress. So these were designer drugs. And one of those designer drugs was MPTP. MPTP was a chemically modified heroin analog that caused end-stage Parkinson's disease overnight in young individuals who had injected themselves intravenously with this heroin compound. 7 individuals in their 20s developed irreversible end-stage Parkinson's. And I did my own PhD work as a 21-year-old. At the time, I was about as tall as Simon, maybe even smaller. I was really this big. And my mentor, Bill Langston, actually gave me the videos. And this is the original MPTP patient that triggered the whole story. So this is unique footage. This man was healthy the day before. And this is when he was found by Bill Langston. This is severe Parkinson's, obviously untreated. And that compound killed every single dopaminergic neuron because, of course, he was exposed to an extremely high intravenous dose. And it was almost a detective story because they found 6 other individuals. They all tracked it back to the same chemist who had manufactured the pesticide. What I find so incredible about that story is those 7 individuals had an intact smell. Even though Simon was referring to this, a reduced smell is common in Parkinson's. They had injected it intravenously. We think that many of the toxic chemicals are inhaled and thereby impair smell. The chemist who manufactured the MPTP developed Parkinson's 7 years later, and he had an abnormal smell. Isn't that fascinating? And why I'm telling you this story, those are some of the folks, the poor young lads that develop Parkinson's. The MPTP is converted to MPP+, which is the actual toxic compound, which looks almost identical to paraquat. Paraquat is a pesticide that has been banned in many countries in the world, even in China. And guess what? It's still used here in Australia, which I think is insane. I think it's incredible. It's a pesticide. It's used to kill, to protect plants. So industry calls it plant protection compounds. They have all sorts of euphemisms in my country. But paraquat is one of the most toxic compounds on the planet. One sip will kill you. And paraquat, this is paraquat in the United States. It's still used abundantly. The Michael J. Fox Foundation is now taking action to ban paraquat. It's been linked to Parkinson's in a number of studies. It's very consistent. And if you feed paraquat to a mouse, to a rat, or other experimental animals, it will kill dopaminergic neurons and cause Parkinson's symptoms. But you're using it today. I'm not saying it's the cause of your Parkinson's, but I think I'm an activist. I really feel that I'm an activist, and I think you should take action in your country against paraquat. And you may want to check out what the Michael J. Fox Foundation is doing in the United States, but I think it's crazy. So what is further evidence that Parkinson's is an environmentally caused disease? There are so-called heat map studies, and my career has been built around heroes. So I have a number of heroes in my life that have shaped my career and that have created the Prof Bloem that's standing here in front of you. Simon is one of them. Another really great hero is André Barbeau. And remember Barbeau? So Barbeau, I never met him, but Barbeau died at a young age. He was a French-Canadian neurologist, and everything he wrote actually later turned out to be true. But he died in his early 50s, and he died just before this paper came out. And Barbeau was the very first man in the world to study the environmental distribution of Parkinson's. And he reasoned that if the environment had nothing to do with Parkinson's, the disease should be spread evenly across the country. And this is Quebec, Montreal, Quebec, sorry, this is Quebec. And what you can see is that Parkinson's is not evenly distributed across Quebec, but there are pouches, there are clusters where Parkinson's is more common. So it's not evenly distributed. And in fact, this is a bit of a technical graph, but this is the dose of the pesticides in water and the risk of Parkinson's. And there's a more or less linear relationship. So the higher the concentration of pesticides in water, the higher the risk of Parkinson's. And it was not evenly distributed. This has now been repeated in a number of countries. This is France. This is the prevalence of Parkinson's in France. And if you can overlay this one-to-one with the use of pesticides in vineyards. You see, there's the Bordeaux region, this is the Mediterranean region, there's the Champagne region. It overlaps one-to-one. The French now acknowledge that Parkinson's is an environmental hazard disease among wine farmers. And again, there is a dose-response relationship in France. The higher the concentration of pesticides on the land, the higher the risk of Parkinson's disease. And in Holland, we're seeing much more Parkinson's in the areas where we develop our famous tulips. And that is something really bizarre. And you know why this is bizarre? You know the symbol, the international symbol of the fight against Parkinson's. You know what it is? It's a tulip. And the same damn tulip in my country is associated with a higher risk of Parkinson's. Isn't it? If you come to think of it, it's ridiculous, isn't it? And this is the James Parkinson tulip. There's even a special James Parkinson tulip. Did you know? It's a real James Parkinson tulip. And this is the symbol of the Dutch Parkinson Patient Association. So pesticides also reach the food chain. So we breathe it, we eat it, and there's one study, and I'll be cautious about this, but I'm just going to mention it to you. There's one study in Hawaii where pesticides were used for pineapple culture. And those pesticides entered the leaves of the pineapple trees. The leaves were fed to cattle, and the pesticides made it to the milk of those cows, which subsequently was found in identifiable doses in supermarkets in Hawaii, and was subsequently found after death in the basal ganglia of the brains of Parkinson patients. It was even found in the milk of breastfeeding mothers. Now, this was an exceptional story that's not been repeated elsewhere. Milk products are consistently related to a higher risk of developing Parkinson's. I don't think that this is because milk is polluted with pesticides. I think this was an extreme condition. But an overdose of milk products, the Dutch eat a lot of cheese, is an interesting relationship. What I'm actually concerned about is for example, wine. So a survey in the Netherlands showed that red wines in Dutch supermarkets, 2023, contain 7 different pesticides, including glyphosate, Roundup, the weed killer that you use to kill the weed. Roundup is found in red wines in Dutch supermarkets in 2023. And then Bayer says, yeah, but it's at a very low concentration. 7 different pesticides. And it adds up. So what I recommend to all my patients is if you've got Parkinson's, and we'll come to that in a minute, wash your vegetables, wash your fruit, eat biological whenever you can. If you want to avoid Parkinson's, you want to steer away from pesticides. If you already have the disease, you definitely want to steer away from pesticides, because there are now 2 new studies, and I'll show you one to show that if you already have Parkinson's and you're still exposed to pesticides, your prognosis is worse. Which makes perfect sense. If you have few dopaminergic neurons left in your brain, you want to do everything to protect those. And there are now 3 studies, and again, this is just one of them, showing that if you already have Parkinson's, things get even worse when you're still exposed to pesticides. Now, I told you I had this mutation in the gene for optimism. There are also protective factors. This is a beautiful paper by Alberto Ascirio and Michael Schwarzschild. There are risk factors and protective factors for Parkinson's. We talked about the risk factors, pesticides, dairy products. Melanoma is an interesting one. Just quickly, melanoma, because we're in Australia. I think this is the #1 melanoma country in the world. If you have Parkinson's, the risk of developing a melanoma is a bit increased. Inadvertently, people think it's because of levodopa treatment, but that's not true. The risk is associated with the disease, not with the treatment. So don't avoid treatment because you want to avoid melanomas, but have your skin checked if you've got Parkinson's, I think particularly in this country. I'm not sure if that's common practice, Simon, but okay, good. What I want to focus on in the next part is the protective factors. And there's a number of them, and I will walk you through the most important ones. One of the factors that is most consistently associated with a lower risk of developing Parkinson's is smoking. Now, please don't start smoking or tell your children to go smoking. And we don't know why this is. It could be that smoking has some intrinsic protective effects. It could be. One thing is that smoking may make your nose less permeable to the pesticides that we inhale. There is good animal work to suggest that pesticides make the gut less permeable to pesticides that we eat. But another explanation could be that if you are born with a lot of dopamine, you are more likely to enjoy a cigarette because you have a tuned up reward system. Dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. So maybe smoking is just a signal, a biomarker, that you have a lot of dopamine, and the same high level of dopamine protects you from dropping below a critical threshold, enough to cause your Parkinson's symptoms. So maybe it's artificial, maybe it's real. We've talked about this with Alberto Ascirio, and it deserves further study. It's the most consistent protective factor in all epidemiological studies, and we don't fully understand it. Another more interesting one is the Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet is associated with a lower risk of developing the disease, but there are now 3 studies to show that if you adhere to the diet after you've been diagnosed, your prognosis is also better. So eat like a Greek and then somebody said, that means lots of souvlaki. No, not the steaks. It's the fish, it's the oil, olives, fruit, veggies, nuts, that kind of stuff. So if you're in doubt, ask your dietitian. If you've got Parkinson's, I would recommend adhering to a Mediterranean diet. The other factor, widely studied, still poorly understood, is a few cups of coffee. Those protect against the risk of developing Parkinson's. Whether coffee helps you after your diagnosis is unknown. I tell my patients in my clinic that I don't know, but if you enjoy a few cups of coffee, take it. It probably also helps to promote bowel movements, and constipation is notorious for all of you. It's a risk factor. So in case I forget, the most commonly made error in my country, well, there's 2 common errors, but one of the 2 is not to treat constipation. It's not part of this presentation, but it's so important that I want to share it with you. Constipation is an early symptom of Parkinson's. It's very common. I think ultimately almost all patients with Parkinson's have constipation. It leads to bacterial overgrowth, changes in the gut microbiome, and those bacteria start to convert levodopa into dopamine in your gut. The dopamine cannot enter your brain, which means that the constipation will lead to a lower efficacy of your Parkinson drugs. So treat constipation aggressively. Exercise, 2 liters of water per day, fibers and laxatives if needed. But treat it. And if you don't know how to do it, ask your GP, ask your Parkinson nurse, ask your neurologist. But don't accept chronic constipation, please. The other error is not to treat the night, sleep. You need dopamine to sleep well, and many neurologists inadvertently think that Parkinson's goes on holiday at night. It doesn't. So you need long-acting dopaminergic drugs to cover the night. And if you sleep better, you'll be better during the day. The other protective factor is exercise. Exercise is, in a number of studies, associated with a lower risk of developing Parkinson's disease. How exercise works is still largely a black box. We don't know, although there are some really cool new studies, and I don't have time to go into those. But I will tell you just one of them. It's a study that we published in Lancet Neurology, and we put people on a stationary bicycle, and we asked them to exercise for 30 minutes at home 3 times a week. And what we showed is that exercising 3 times a week, where you crank up your heart rate a little bit, was associated with a stabilization of motor symptoms, whereas the control group declined over time, which is what you would expect in Parkinson's disease. Daniel Korkos in the United States did a similar study on a treadmill and found the exact same thing. So that is not the same as disease modifying. We're all looking for treatments to slow down the progression of Parkinson's. I think exercise is closest to delivering that promise. Out of all the interventions in the world, it's those 2 studies, the one by Daniel Korkos, the one by my group, but we think we're actually even closer because these are brand new data. This was published in Annals of Neurology late last year, and in our study we also did brain scans. And lo and behold, there's a beautiful paper in Annals of Neurology. We showed that in the control group that was only doing stretching exercises, the brain shrank a little bit. The brain shrinks over time, happens all the time. And we stopped the brain from shrinking through exercise. And moreover, the exercise group, but not the stretch group, made new functional connectivity between the damaged basal ganglia and the healthy brain cortex. So if you're on the treadmill, if you're on your stationary bicycle, if you're in the pool, and you think, I'm not motivated to exercise, what you should think is, that brain is sprouting, it's making new connections. I mean, isn't that motivating? Yeah. And again, before I forget, there are 3 components to exercise. And please listen carefully. One is the aerobic component. And you can titrate it to your heart rate, but the nerve that innervates the heart is also affected by Parkinson's. That's not to worry about at all, so don't even think about it, other than the fact that people with Parkinson's, some of you folks, have difficulty cranking up your heart rate above 100. So if you go to the gym and your exercise drill coach is trying to crank up your heart rate and it doesn't work, and he's taking his whip, trying to get you to titrate it not to your heart rate, titrate it to your breathing pattern. And the best dose is when you can still maintain a conversation, but your sentences are a bit briefer. Does it make sense? Then you've got the right dose. And I tell all my patients, exercise every day. And why every day? If you exercise 3 times a week, there's always tomorrow. If you have to exercise every day, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You just build it into your regime. The second component, so that's the aerobic component, 30 minutes each day. And there's a really cool study by Giselle Petzinger from the United States, where because sometimes people think, I've got a busy life, when do I have 30 minutes? 30 times 1 minute turns out to be as good as 1 block of 30 minutes. So if you don't take the escalator and climb the stairs, you've got your 1 minute snack. And we call it now exercise snacks. So instead of snacking on your French fries, or you now snack on exercise. Isn't that really cool? The second component is the sheer volume of activities, and that's an independent factor. So taking 6,000 steps at a leisure pace without panting is better than 4,000 steps at a leisure pace. So increase your volume, add 30 minutes of aerobic workout, and add a bit of strength training, particularly of your hip muscles and upper leg muscles. They become a little bit weaker over time, and that may hamper your ability to rise from a chair, or rise from a car, or rise from your bed. Those are the three existing exercise modalities that you should adhere to. So, back to pesticides. You know, I'm a man on a mission. And particularly this week, so yes, I have a forgiving wife, but there's a big debate in Europe right now around glyphosate, which is Roundup, which is going to be extended for another 10 years, but not up to me. Because what is the problem? In Europe, probably in Australia and the United States, pesticides are being screened for neurotoxicity by exposing an experimental animal to the compound and to see if it becomes Parkinsonian. And that is a major flaw. And the reason is that the threshold for you to develop Parkinsonian signs, and this is true for humans, but it's also true for animals, is you only develop Parkinsonian signs if you've lost 70 to 80% of your dopaminergic neurons. Which means that, and this is beautiful about the brain, it has a reserve capacity. But that same reserve capacity means that you may miss relevant toxicity if you wait for symptoms to arise. So this would be a genuinely safe pesticide. It doesn't kill any dopaminergic neurons. Does that make sense? This would be a truly unsafe pesticide. It kills so many neurons that you see symptoms, right? Does it make sense? But this is what is happening all the time. If a pesticide kills 60% of dopaminergic neurons in a mouse, the mouse looks happy and safe, but the compound isn't safe. This is a major problem. And a second major problem is that we are all exposed to cocktails, to mixtures of different pesticides. Remember, I mentioned the wine, the Dutch wine, that contains 7 different pesticides. There is a sprint study in Europe where they have looked at the number of pesticides in farmhouses. Guess what? How many pesticides are present in an average Dutch farmhouse? In house dust, on the kitchen table, what do you think? 30. Higher. 110. 110. This is the reality. And it includes pesticides that have already been banned for some time because they persist in our climate. And it's the sum of 110 times a little bit that is causing Parkinson's. And this is a technical slide, but this is glyphosate. Glyphosate is Roundup. This is the MPTP. This is the number of dopamine cells. This is saline. So you see that MPTP kills dopamine neurons, but if you add glyphosate, it gets even worse. This is Kimberly Paul, who is also one of my heroes. Kimberly Paul looked at cocktails in California. And as it turns out, certain cocktails are more commonly associated with Parkinson's than other cocktails. This is a paper in Nature, just came out. If you take a cocktail and you take a single pesticide, it's toxic to the mouse in a high dose. The moment you add a second pesticide, they're both highly toxic at very low doses. But it's never been tested. And you can already see Monsanto or Bayer or Syngenta say, it's the other compound in the mix, it's not mine. It's insane. So we need better animal experiments. And in case I forget, I don't want to kill thousands and thousands of animals. We need urgently in vitro alternatives so that we don't have to kill animals, but the current gold standard is still an animal study. Just wanted to make that disclosure that, and in Holland, clever people are working on virtual human bodies where you can mimic pesticides toxicity in vitro models. what is interesting is that the European Food and Safety Authority, that's the European institution, now admits that their own procedures give us no insight into the risks of Parkinson's disease. They admit it. But this week, Europe is going to decide about glyphosate, about Roundup. And the dossier doesn't include that limitation. That's what the paper to the Lancet Neurology is about. The dossier, they acknowledge it's wrong and they ignore it in the files, pushed by industry. I think it's insane. So to summarize, so it's perfect timing, Simon. Two things that I wanted to say is, one is Parkinson's. I think I've called Parkinson's the canary in the coal mine. Was that used here in your country as well? So when the canary stopped singing, it meant that the air was toxic and you had to get away. Pesticides also cause cancer. Trichloroethylene also causes cancer. I think Parkinson's is just the visible tip of the iceberg of what we're doing to ourselves. So I think we're living in a time of environmental diseases, and Parkinson's is just the tip of the iceberg. The people that are exposed are primarily those who are working with it, work exposure. We now know that nearby residents are also exposed. If you live nearby farmland, you're at risk. And through the food chain, ultimately all of us are affected. All of this is described in the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. I was fortunate enough to hand a copy of the Dutch version of the book to the Queen of the Netherlands, and see how happy she looks. It's almost as if her husband just proposed to her. Isn't that incredible? You can buy the book here, and in case you're thinking I'm promoting my salary, no, all proceeds are devoted to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. And I want to end with an upbeat note. Tom Isaacs, a wonderful ambassador for Parkinson's, he says, this is a time of cautious hope instead of conservative paternalism. I want to end there. And
that's wonderful. I will kick off some questions. Please.
Of course. I'm Christine J. Chandran, in case you don't know me. I'm very motivated about this theme because I've read your book, and I've heard Ray Dorsey speak, the co-author of the book, and his talk at the World Parkinson's Congress was amazing, and really motivated me that we need to learn about this. Yes, my question is, my uncle has Parkinson's, but he's in denial, but he says he's in his late 80s, but he used Roundup. He was a farmer, a cane farmer in North Queensland. Roundup as well as Xamamine with the G, yeah. And so we're wondering if that could be related to Parkinson's, that he
yeah, so again, it's impossible to tell any given individual that this is the cause of your Parkinson's. So, and I say that, first of all, because I really don't know, and second, also to alleviate concern so that people look back and regret and say, if only I hadn't used Roundup, I would not have Parkinson's. But at the same time, I can't say it's not the cause. And at the group level, it's clear. The case for Roundup is not so clear as for paraquat. I think Roundup could be a cause of Parkinson's. My concern about Roundup is it's not proven to be safe because the criteria are wrong. And there are 6 studies that have linked Roundup to Parkinson's. Is that definitive proof? No. Is it a reason for concern? Absolutely.
Before we go to the next question, Bas, can I just ask you, the rates of Parkinson's are about 1 in 100 if you're over 60, or 1 in 1,000 generally. With the influence of pesticides, we've sort of looked at the literature, it's about triple the ratio when you look at those old studies. So that would be, 3 in 1,000? So what's the new data showing us about that number? Because you're not saying Parkinson's is caused by pesticides, you're saying it's a contributing factor to some cases.
Yes, I think knowing that Parkinson's was bitterly rare prior to 1817, I think any new case of Parkinson's is one too many.
But having said that, the Greeks have it in their literature, the Egyptians have it in literature.
But rare, sporadic.
Well,
it was.
They're not writing as much.
No, but, for example...
We don't have a healthcare system.
I think there are wonderful and accurate descriptions of gout, of diabetes, of all sorts of diseases. Parkinson's, it's there, or it could be Parkinson's, but the full-blown picture, it's rare. They've looked at paint. Rembrandt, for example, painted breast cancer very accurately in one of the nude portraits of one of his many wives. And he didn't understand breast cancer. He just painted what he saw. And that typical stoop posture, it's not there. So I think it was there, but it was rare.
And I think we've got at the back. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paula. I've had Parkinson's for 33 years. I was first symptomatic at 19. I've got Parkin gene. My mum's got 2 and dad's got 1. My mum and dad came from villages in Greece. Would that genetic version of Parkinson's been affected by pesticides in Greece? How do they get the genetic mutation?
Right. I don't think I'm not an expert on genetics myself, but I don't think that the Parkin mutations are very different from each other. So I think whether Parkin arose in Greece or in elsewhere in the world doesn't really matter. I know that Parkin is one of the genes that affects mitochondria. Yeah. And guess what pesticides do? They kill mitochondria.
My mum doesn't have Parkinson's and she's got 2 bad genes. So
yeah, exactly. So that's one other reason. So the penetrance, the word penetrance is a technical word for you have a gene, but not everybody gets the disease. So the penetrance, for example, for LARC2 is 70%, right. Roughly the same for GBA. And you can have genetic mutations in Parkin genes and not develop the disease. So you need something else. And Parkin in animal models interacts with pesticides.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I've lost the other microphone in the room. There we are in the front, Mrs. Errington.
Yeah, hi Baz. We missed a little bit here. The 3 exercise things, aerobics was to relate to heart rate. What was the second one?
The volume of activities.
Wasn't that the third
simply
one?
taking more steps. And the third one is strength training.
Strength training, volume and strength. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then we'll go over here. Yes.
Yes, I'm curious about the link between the pesticides and Parkinson's, and is that also connected with Lewy bodies in terms of Lewy body dementia? As my partner here was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia 2 years ago, and this year he's now been recorded to be suffering from Parkinson's. So is there a linkage there? I mean, I know there's a sort of shadow zone between the two to some extent.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. There's still a bit of a debate in the literature and among experts about what Lewy body disease is. I'm in the camp that says it's one disease. I think Parkinson's disease... Oh, are you in the other camp? Yes. Oh, that's interesting. They both cause Lewy bodies, and we know that Parkinson's is not one disease. You should call it Parkinson's diseases. And for some it starts in the gut, for others it starts in the nose, yet for others it starts in the brain. And why not start in the cortex? So what's your point?
So at the next Movement Disorders meeting, they've asked me to do the controversies section. You'll know this on the committee. And so we're going to have Dan Weintraub versus Glenda Halliday. And the bottom line is the neuropathology is different. And the really important part about this is because, and this is published in Brain a couple of weeks ago, I published it. Basically what dementia with Lewy body patients do is that they protect their cells and then fall in a heap. Whereas Parkinson's disease, what happens is a bit like playing cards and you give a card away and give a card away. So Parkinson's has this long disease, 15, 20 years, and then you dement. Dementia with Lewy bodies, you get it later, and when you get it, bang, everything happens. And the really important reason that is really important is because if we knew what the dementia with Lewy body patients were doing to protect themselves against the synucleinopathy, we should treat our Parkinson's patients with whatever that magic is the point I'd make.
This is wonderful, 2 friends debating. So we have a paper that came out this week in Brain. This week. I'm sure you've read it. And no, but it's a really cool paper, and it helps to motivate you. So we did a big study in 520 patients who they received deep phenotyping, but they were scanned on the same scanner at the Radboud University Center repeatedly over time. And we divided people into rapid progression and slow progression. The difference between people with bad Parkinson's and benign Parkinson's or slow Parkinson's is not the basal ganglia, it's the cortex. So what we have shown in a number of studies is that the basal ganglia lose their function, but the healthy cortex takes over functions. In fact, this is what is happening with exercise, the sprouting. The moment the Lewy bodies reach the cortex, that's when you're done, because now your compensation collapses. So if you've got Lewy body disease and your compensation is gone right from the outset, that's why the cart house collapses more. That could be a possible explanation, right?
We're in violent agreement. We're in violent agreement. Mr. Nish.
Thank you, Baz and Simon, for today. It's very much appreciated. The other environmental explosion that's taking place, or catastrophe that's taking place, is the use of the presence of microplastics in our system. Is there any link been drawn between microplastics and Parkinson's?
So I was on PFAS is not microplastics, is it? That's the other concern. No. So I honestly don't know. If I speak to environmental toxicologists, and I speak to them a lot these days, they think ultimately it's the mixture. It's the sum of everything we're exposed to, and that sum might well include microplastics. I was actually on the Dutch National Talk Show last week, and there's a hefty debate in Holland around a factory in Rotterdam that's producing PFAS. And because they had an issue in the same session where I was to speak on Parkinson's on PFAS, I looked up the literature, and there were 2 or 3 studies that link PFAS, which I had never associated with Parkinson's, to toxicity to dopamine cells. So ultimately, I think it's the sum of all the things in our environment, that determines whether or not you develop Parkinson's. That's why it's also so horrendously difficult to tell in any individual that, what caused your Parkinson's. So I don't know of any studies, but I can easily see how it might contribute.
So we're going to be a little bit late going for lunch, coffee, but I can see Marion Hoffman. It's great to hear your voice on the incoming. Specific question, any specific exercises for strength training? You mentioned basically doing the leg thrusts and squats, building up those big quad muscles. Is that the sort of thing that we should be aiming for?
Exactly. So the thigh muscles, the upper leg muscles, that's important. So squats is important. In terms of the aerobic exercise, I'm not sure if that's also part of the question. Nobody studied which form of aerobic exercise is better. So whether you play basketball, volleyball, tennis, jogging, cycling, it doesn't matter. Do what you like and make sure you do something that you adhere to, or you can throw it into the mix. There's one exception. It's a wonderful study by Jay Alberts, who went on a cycling tour with patients and professionals on a tandem bicycle. And the healthcare professional was sitting in the front, the individual with Parkinson's was sitting in the back. And most of those folks, after that day of cycling, felt dramatically better. And then he thought about it, and the healthy person was determining the pace in the front. So he then did a study, published, where he compared 2 types of cycling, either with a low resistance, but like this, or with a high resistance and like this. The net workout was identical, but the health benefits were greater for low resistance and fast movements.
I spent the first 10 years of my life working with pesticide regulations and things. The thing for me is, where does the impetus come from now to get your activism going?
Yeah. Someone online has asked the same thing. How do we connect globally?
Right. Well, the book gives some recommendations, but I think we should bundle forces. I think I'm inspired by Ray Dorsey, and Ray Dorsey says we should become loud. HIV was deemed to be untreatable until individuals with HIV chained themselves to the front door of industry and of regulatory bodies demanding better treatments. And I love working with you folks because I think for whatever reason, people with Parkinson's are just the nicest people on the planet. But I sometimes think we are too nice, we're too kind, and we're not loud enough. And I think you've seen my presentation. I'm not saying Parkinson's is 100% environmental, but I think there's a large contribution, and we should become loud. Learn from each other, read the book, read the recommendations, the final pages on activism, and bundle forces.
I think 2 points. One, there's a lady with a clipboard at the front desk who would like to try and connect you. So she's wearing a nice bright red top, so talk to her in coffee. And we're going to have one last quick question. So you've been very patient, and then we'll go for coffee.
Thank you.
Can you speak into the microphone, please?
You are an activist.
Right into the microphone.
Yeah.
You are an activist. You also mentioned that pesticides are a big issue, creating this Parkinson's disease. You also mentioned that the large companies that manufacture the pesticides are involved in this. What are we doing to make those companies accountable?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Okay, what are you doing?
Well, I'm very active in my country and in Europe, and I speak to Bayer, to Syngenta, to Monsanto. You know what the other striking thing is? All the studies that are proposed to the European body are performed by industry themselves. They can repeat experiments as often as they like until it gives them the desired result. There's a paper in The Guardian showing that industry leaves out 30% of the studies that show toxicity out of the records. I mean, it's, So what do? They have a powerful lobby. There's $8.4 billion in Roundup each year earned by the joint companies. So their lobby is powerful. But I'm also a powerful activist. My name is being heard and seen. I publish a lot about this. I think your voices collectively, you're with 7 million in the world. Your voice too, and with your background, I think we should bundle forces, bring our countries together and be loud and make ourselves heard.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay.